The courtroom buzzed with activity, people whispering, rustling papers, and waiting for their turn to be called. Judge Samuel Walker, a tall, stern-looking man with silver hair, sat at the bench, glancing through his docket with an air of impatience. Known for his no-nonsense attitude, he was respected for running a tight ship, but also criticized for being quick to judge people based on appearances. Today seemed no different. Maya Carter, a young black woman in her early 30s, sat quietly in the back of the room. She was dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her briefcase resting on the floor beside her. She looked out of place compared to the other attorneys, who wore expensive suits and carried an air of formality. But Maya wasn't fazed. She was here for a small matter, a parking ticket that had escalated into a court appearance because of a clerical error. It wasn't her first time in a courtroom, but this situation was different. When her name was called, Maya stood up confidently and walked to the front of the room. Judge Walker barely glanced at her. He had already made up his mind about her before she opened her mouth. She looked to him like just another young woman trying to wiggle out of her responsibilities. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice firm, "it says here you're contesting a parking ticket issued last month. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied, her tone polite but steady. "I'm here to explain." "Save it," Judge Walker interrupted, raising his hand. "Everyone has excuses for breaking the law. The rules are the same for everyone, and you need to follow them. You parked illegally, and now you're trying to get out of the fine." Maya paused, her calm exterior hiding a flicker of irritation. "Your Honor, I'm not trying to avoid responsibility. I believe this is a misunderstanding. I was parked in an authorized space for official business." "Official business?" Judge Walker cut her off again, narrowing his eyes. "What kind of official business? Running errands for someone?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people exchanged glances, surprised by the judge's tone. Maya took a slow breath, her hands resting lightly on the podium in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but controlled, "if I may be allowed to finish, I can clarify." But Judge Walker wasn't listening. He had already decided she was wasting the court's time. "I've heard enough," he said sharply. "You're fined $150. Next time, don't abuse the system." The courtroom grew quieter. Maya didn't move, her calm gaze fixed on the judge. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather case. She flipped it open and placed it on the podium, revealing her federal badge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Maya Carter. The official business I mentioned was a meeting with federal agents regarding an active investigation. I believe I deserve a chance to explain myself fully." The judge froze, his face paling as he stared at the badge. The room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, Judge Walker really looked at Maya, not just her clothes, not just her appearance, but at the person standing before him. And for the first time in a long while, he realized he might have made a mistake. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. The judge, still staring at Maya's badge, seemed caught off guard. His earlier confidence faltered. He coughed lightly and straightened in his seat, trying to mask his embarrassment. But the change in his tone was noticeable. "Assistant U.S. Attorney?" Judge Walker asked, his voice quieter now. "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied, her tone even and professional. She remained calm, though she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. The murmurs started again, louder this time. People whispered to one another, clearly surprised by the revelation. Maya's presence and title had flipped the energy in the room. A few attorneys in the audience, who recognized her, exchanged knowing glances, while others looked stunned. Judge Walker glanced at the badge again before clearing his throat. "I see. Perhaps I spoke too soon." He fumbled with his glasses and pretended to review the papers in front of him. "Miss Carter, why don't you explain the situation to the court?" Maya held her composure. She didn't want to let the judge off the hook too easily. She had encountered this kind of bias before, being judged not for her work or abilities, but for how she looked. She wasn't going to ignore it, but she also knew how to handle the situation with grace. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "As I was trying to explain earlier, I was parked in a space reserved for official use. I was attending a meeting with federal agents as part of an investigation. The ticket was issued in error because the officer didn't notice my government placard displayed on the dashboard." The judge nodded quickly, clearly trying to save face. "I see. That does seem like an oversight." He tapped his pen against the desk, avoiding direct eye contact with her. Maya continued, her tone firm but polite. "I contacted the issuing office to resolve the matter, but unfortunately, the ticket was not cleared from the system, which is why I'm here today." "That's unfortunate," Judge Walker said, his voice quieter now. "I apologize for any inconvenience this has caused you." The apology seemed hollow to Maya, but she simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify." The judge looked uncomfortable. He quickly dismissed the case and waived the fine, eager to move on. "Case dismissed," he said, tapping his gavel. "Next case, please." But the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Maya could feel it. She glanced briefly at the audience and saw a mix of reactions: surprise, respect, even admiration. Some of the attorneys gave her small nods, acknowledging her professionalism. As she turned to leave, she could hear the whispers growing louder behind her. "That's the federal prosecutor," someone murmured. The judge didn't see that coming. Maya walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. But inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just one small example of a much bigger problem. How often were people judged based on nothing more than assumptions, and how many didn't have the power or position to push back? Maya knew this wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning of an important conversation, one she was ready to have, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As Maya walked out of the courtroom, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle on her shoulders. While she had handled the situation with grace, she couldn't help but think about the countless people who might not have the resources or confidence to stand up for themselves. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Judge Walker leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the files before him. His mind wasn't on the next case. He was replaying the encounter with Maya, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and regret. For years, Judge Walker had prided himself on being a fair and efficient judge. But today, he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. Maya's calm demeanor and quiet strength had shaken him. "Federal prosecutor," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He realized he hadn't even given her a chance to explain herself before dismissing her. During the court's lunch recess, Judge Walker stepped into his chambers. His clerk, Emily, followed close behind, carrying a stack of files. Emily was a young, sharp law graduate who admired the judge, but wasn't afraid to speak her mind when necessary. "Rough morning?" Emily asked, setting the files on his desk. Judge Walker sighed and rubbed his temples. "You could say that," he replied. Emily hesitated before speaking. "With all due respect, Judge, I think you made a mistake with Miss Carter earlier." He looked up at her, surprised. "You think so?" Emily nodded. "She's well known in legal circles. She's been part of some high-profile cases. If you'd given her a chance to speak earlier, you might have avoided all that awkwardness." The judge leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. "You're right," he admitted. I assumed things I shouldn't have. That's not the kind of judge I want to be." Emily nodded again but didn't say more. She could tell he was already deep in thought. Later that day, Judge Walker decided to take a bold step. He asked his clerk to call Maya and invite her back to his chambers for a private conversation. He wasn't sure if she would agree, but he felt it was important to apologize personally. Maya, to his relief, accepted the invitation. She returned to the courthouse that afternoon, her expression calm but guarded. As she stepped into his chambers, Judge Walker stood to greet her. "Miss Carter," he began, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Maya nodded. "Of course, Judge Walker. What can I do for you?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to apologize," he said finally, "not just for interrupting you earlier, but for making assumptions about you before you even had a chance to speak. That was wrong of me." Maya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but this isn't just about me. This happens to people every day, people who don't have a badge or a title to back them up. What happened this morning is part of a bigger problem." Judge Walker nodded, her words hitting home. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And I'd like to do better. I'd like to hear more about your perspective, if you're willing to share." Maya tilted her head slightly, surprised by his openness. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." The room was quiet as Maya and Judge Walker sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Maya was cautious. She'd seen people apologize before, only to defend their actions moments later. But there was something in Judge Walker's expression that made her think he might actually be willing to listen. "I'm not sure where to start," Judge Walker admitted, breaking the silence. He folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward slightly. "This morning, I assumed things about you based on nothing that mattered. And I know that's not the kind of judge I should be." Maya appreciated his honesty, but she wasn't about to let him off easily. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "this isn't just about one mistake. It's about how those mistakes happen and how often they go unchecked. Do you know how many people walk into courtrooms like this one and are judged before they even say a word?" The judge looked at her, his face showing genuine thought. "I suppose it happens more often than I realize," he admitted. "I've heard the term implicit bias, but I don't think I've ever really considered how it might apply to me." "Implicit bias isn't about being a bad person," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "It's about the assumptions we've been taught, sometimes without even realizing it. This morning, you saw me and made a judgment based on my appearance. If I hadn't shown you my badge, you might never have taken the time to hear me out." Judge Walker nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And I've been sitting on this bench for years, making decisions that affect people's lives. If I'd done this to you, how many others have I misjudged?" Maya appreciated his willingness to reflect, but she wanted to push the conversation further. "It's not just about you, Judge Walker. It's about the system. The justice system is supposed to be fair, but too often, it's not. People who don't have the right connections, the right resources, or the right look are dismissed, ignored, or punished more harshly." The judge sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I've always thought of myself as someone who treats everyone equally. But maybe I've been fooling myself." "Awareness is the first step," Maya said. "But awareness isn't enough. What are you going to do differently moving forward?" Judge Walker looked at her, his eyes steady. "That's a fair question. I don't have all the answers yet, but I want to start by educating myself. I'll look into bias training, not just for myself, but for everyone who works in this courthouse." "That's a start," Maya said, her tone softening slightly. "But real change takes more than training. It takes accountability. It takes people being willing to call out the problems when they see them." The judge nodded again. "And it takes people like you to keep us honest. Thank you for speaking up, Ms. Carter. You've given me a lot to think about." Maya stood, preparing to leave. "Thank you for listening," she said. "That's more than most people are willing to do." As she walked out of the chambers, Maya felt a flicker of hope. Conversations like these didn't solve everything, but they were a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed to spark real change. As Maya left Judge Walker's chambers, she couldn't help but reflect on the conversation. It was rare for someone in a position of power to admit their mistakes, and even rarer for them to seek change. Still, Maya knew one apology and one conversation weren't enough to fix the deep-seated issues in the justice system. She hoped the judge's words would turn into meaningful action. The next morning, Judge Walker arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His mind was still on what Maya had said. He sat at his desk, sipping his coffee, and opened his laptop. A quick search for implicit bias training for judges brought up several programs and workshops. He jotted down a few notes, determined to bring this up with his colleagues during the next judicial meeting. Later that day, during a break in court proceedings, Judge Walker spoke to Emily, his clerk. "I've been thinking a lot about our discussion yesterday," he said. "Do you think the staff here could benefit from some kind of training on bias and fairness?" Emily's face lit up with approval. "Absolutely, Judge. It's not just about judges. Everyone who interacts with the public in this courthouse could benefit. Clerks, bailiffs, even the attorneys. Bias can show up in subtle ways, and if we're not aware of it, we can't fix it." The judge nodded, feeling a sense of resolve. "Let's make it happen," he said. Meanwhile, Maya returned to her office, where her colleagues were eager to hear about her day in court. A fellow attorney, Rachel, leaned against Maya's desk, grinning. "So, I heard you gave Judge Walker a run for his money yesterday." Maya chuckled. "I wouldn't say that, but I did get him to think, which is more than I expected." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Think about what?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her tone growing serious. "About how bias shows up in courtrooms and how people in power need to do better." I could see he was genuinely surprised when he realized who I was. It made me wonder, what happens to people who don't have the same chance to prove themselves? How many of them get written off without a second thought? Rachel nodded, her smile fading. "Too many, I'm sure. But you standing up for yourself might make him pause next time. That's something." Maya nodded, though her mind was already on what more could be done. The next week, Judge Walker sent out an announcement to all courthouse staff. He had arranged for a mandatory workshop on bias awareness and fairness in the courtroom. The announcement raised some eyebrows, with a few staff members grumbling about it being unnecessary. But others, like Emily, welcomed the move and encouraged their peers to take it seriously. Maya, too, received a copy of the announcement. She read it with a small smile, appreciating the effort but knowing there was still more to be done. Change, she reminded herself, wasn't a one-time event. It was a process, and every small step mattered. That week, Maya received an email from Judge Walker. It was a simple message, thanking her again for her patience and insights. He promised to continue learning and doing better. Maya replied briefly but sincerely, letting him know she hoped he'd follow through. She closed her laptop and took a deep breath. The wheels of change turned slowly, but they turned. And as long as there were people willing to speak up, like her, and people willing to listen, like Judge Walker, there was hope. Weeks passed, and life began to settle back into its usual rhythm for Maya. She had returned to her work as a federal prosecutor, dealing with cases that ranged from fraud to organized crime. But in the back of her mind, she kept thinking about her conversation with Judge Walker. She hoped that the judge's willingness to make changes was not just a temporary moment of reflection. After all, real change in the justice system required more than one person's efforts. It required the commitment of everyone involved. One afternoon, Maya received a call from a colleague, Michael, who worked in the Civil Rights Division. He had been following her interaction with Judge Walker and was impressed by how she had handled herself. "Maya, I heard about your meeting with the judge. That took guts," Michael said. Maya smiled. "Thanks, Michael. I just spoke the truth. It's not always easy, but someone has to say it." "I agree, but the thing is, that's not something you see often. Too many people just accept things as they are, even when they know something's wrong," Michael said. "Do you think Judge Walker will actually follow through with his plan to tackle bias?" Maya thought for a moment before answering. "I think he's trying to make a difference, but it's going to take more than one workshop to change a system that's been built on these biases for so long. It's a start, though." Michael was quiet for a moment before responding. "You know, you've got an opportunity here. You've already got the judge's ear, and you're in a position where you can make a bigger impact. What if you started pushing for change in more areas, not just in your own cases? Maya raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I'm talking about pushing for systemic change. Things like changing sentencing guidelines, pushing for more diversity in the courtroom, or even working on public education about the justice system. Michael explained. You've got a voice. People are listening to you now. Why not use that to make a bigger difference? The idea was tempting. Maya had always believed in the importance of fair treatment, but the thought of taking on a larger mission made her feel both excited and nervous. It wasn't just about changing one judge's perspective. It was about creating real, lasting reform in a system that often felt stacked against those who needed justice the most. Later that week, Maya sat down at her desk, staring at her computer screen. She pulled up Judge Walker's contact information and hesitated for a moment. Then, taking a deep breath, she typed a message. She thanked him for his willingness to explore bias training and suggested they meet to discuss ways they could work together on broader reforms. Maya hit send and leaned back in her chair. She knew it was a bold move, but she also knew that bold moves were sometimes necessary to bring about change. The next day, Judge Walker responded. His reply was brief, but it made her heart race with hope. He expressed interest in meeting and further discussing how they could work together on criminal justice reform. They set a time for the following week. As Maya walked out of her office later that day, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just about winning cases or gaining recognition. This was about using her position, her experience, and her voice to help create a system that was truly just for everyone. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and Maya knew it. But as she looked at the message from Judge Walker, she felt a glimmer of optimism. The chance to change the system was within her reach, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The following week, Maya met with Judge Walker in a quiet conference room at the courthouse. They sat across from each other, a large wooden table between them. Both were eager but cautious, aware that this conversation could be the start of something much bigger. Judge Walker spoke first. "Miss Carter," he began, "I've been thinking about our last discussion. You're right. Bias doesn't just show up in the courtroom. It's embedded in the system itself. If we want to make real change, we have to be willing to look at the bigger picture." Maya nodded, grateful for his open-mindedness. "Exactly. We can start with small steps like bias training, but we need to push for broader reforms too. I think it's important to focus on creating a justice system that treats everyone fairly, no matter their background or appearance." Judge Walker took a deep breath, his face serious. "I agree, but how do we even begin to address something that has been part of the system for so long?" Maya leaned forward, her eyes focused. "It starts with acknowledging the problem, like we did last time. After that, we need to make sure that policies and practices reflect that understanding. For example, we can push for changes in how people are sentenced. We know that certain groups, like Black and Latino defendants, often receive harsher sentences than others, even for the same crime. Why is that? And what can we do to change it?" Judge Walker thought about it for a moment. "It's true. There's a lot of data that shows racial disparities in sentencing, but it's hard to fix something that has been ingrained in the system for so long." Maya smiled slightly. "It's not easy, but it's possible. We could advocate for more transparency in sentencing, maybe even pushing for more oversight. We could also work on reforming how bail is set, because right now, too many people are locked up simply because they can't afford it. That's not justice." The judge's expression softened. "You make good points, but reforming these systems will take time, and there will be a lot of resistance. How do we get others to see things from our perspective?" Maya's eyes sparkled with determination. "We start by educating people. We can work with local organizations, host public forums, and even use media to raise awareness. We have to show people that these issues matter, and that everyone deserves to be treated fairly under the law." Judge Walker sat back in his chair, considering her words. "It sounds like a big task, but I think we're ready for it. I can see how passionate you are about this, and I want to help make these changes happen. Let's start by working together to develop a plan." Maya's heart raced as she realized that this conversation was not just about talking anymore. It was about action. "I'm glad to hear that, Your Honor. I think we can really make a difference. It won't be easy, but if we take it step by step, we can move the needle toward justice for all." Over the next few months, Maya and Judge Walker met regularly, working together to build a framework for reform. They drafted proposals for sentencing and bail reform, collaborated with community leaders, and began the long process of pushing for change within the justice system. Their partnership became a symbol of what was possible when people in positions of power were willing to listen and work together. Although there was still much to be done, Maya knew that they had made an important start, and she felt proud knowing that her voice, along with the judge's commitment, was helping to shape a system that was fairer, more transparent, and most importantly, more just. As she sat back and looked at the work they had accomplished, Maya realized that this was the beginning of a long journey. But it was a journey worth taking. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful about the future of the justice system.